A huge amount of information and a kind of real richness, I think, from all three of you. I think Sorcha and Susanne have very clearly made the case for linking protection and livelihoods, and have given us some quite useful models and tools to help us do that. And then I think Helen has very helpfully kind of placed that in the wider policy context. We have 20 minutes left. So I think I'm just going to throw this open and let's see what your thoughts are. It'd be particularly interesting for those of you working within agencies to hear from you how useful and how accessible, appropriate might some of these approaches be to you, to those of you working in operational agencies. But also I'm sure you may have some thoughts on the wider policy context as well. So let's throw the floor open. Yeah, and if you could speak into the microphone, because we've got people following us online as well.
Yeah, I mean, thanks ever so much for the presentation. I mean, I thought they were. I found that really refreshing. I mean, I come from sort of a long ICRC background years and years ago, and I wouldn't imagine why anyone would want to separate livelihoods and protection issues. I mean, it's just fundamental in the sort of approach that I sort of grew up in, really. But I mean, there are a few challenges, and I don't have the help. I just put 2 or 3 things down that maybe to share. And I think, you know, I mean, I really like the way you link this with IHL and with obligations under that, and with issues of psychosocial things as well. And many of the things that you can look at from a livelihoods point of view, you can look at from a protection point of view. You know, people face all sorts of protection issues by being displaced, but people are also displaced by failure of their livelihoods and you know, and economic collapse in their economic security at household level. So it all goes round and round, really. I mean, 2 or 3 things where there are challenges, I think, even with my sort of extremely positive view linking these together, is in situations like Gaza or Sri Lanka during the time when you undertook this piece of work, particularly Jaffna. I mean, those sort of situations where basically a wall is built around the place and everything's cut off, and certainly in the Gaza situation where destroying livelihoods and the means of production at a vast scale is basically a way of conducting hostilities in some sense. It makes it quite a dilemma, because one can do all sorts of creative livelihoods work in the most extreme situations. I mean, I've seen wonderful things in displaced camps in northern Uganda, you know, where you just don't think about any opportunities, but there are, and have great value psychologically and even if economically quite small. But if you start to do that sort of thing in Gaza or Jaffna, when it was isolated like a little Gaza, well, then it's almost de-development. And you know, it can definitely have positive developments positive results for the beneficiaries in the short term, or immediately the difficulties that they face. But you're going from a cash-based exporting economy of high-value goods right down to basically something that's sort of self-subsistence within the Jaffna Peninsula or self-subsistence within Gaza, which, you know, if that's the way things were going to go, I mean, well, okay, that's good, that helps people. But the problem is that then, you know, when Jaffna opens up, well, then you're doing that community no favours, because then it's unable to bounce back, because suddenly it's open to a wider market economy again. It's quite a dilemma, because, you know, we've been not reluctant to try and we've not really had the funding, I suppose, you know, to try and reorientate people's livelihoods in these times of great restrictions. But you know, you don't know when these restrictions are going to end. And in the Gaza case, well, you know, is everything opened up in Gaza again, so that people can export flowers and roses and things to the West, or is it just a deception? And you know, it's difficult to know where to place it. I think that whole area is, you know, are we doing really people favours or not? I mean, there must be some sort of middle ground, I suppose, where you can do one and also prepare for the other. But it's difficult. Humanitarian access is one thing that wasn't up there. Humanitarian access for agencies. Again, in the Sri Lanka context, you know, people are able to return to the north. It's 250,000 people. Agencies have access to do livelihoods recovery work, but they're only able to undertake 1 or 2 livelihoods recovery activities. And in these households, they need 4 or 5 or 6 inputs over a long period of time, which you did put up. You know, people, you know, households with, you know, a very high rate of psychosocial trauma, disability, single-headed households. You know, these households, they need, you know, vocational training, cash grants, community-based work, and you're just not allowed you're not allowed to do that by the concerned authorities. You can only have 1 input. And that means, you know, in an environment where there are agencies that have great experience in livelihood recovery in very, very difficult situations are unable to do anything like the best that they really can. And, you know, it won't work. And then the other thing, again, I'll just use the Sri Lanka example, and Helen certainly touched on it, is other actors in this field. I mean, Sri Lanka is you know, with all these restrictions, it's difficult enough, but it's the international financial institutions, the IFIs, particularly the World Bank, with $100 million of this rapid recovery facility, you know, is not linked in any way whatsoever with UNDP. It's not linked with the clusters, with the humanitarian system, which is doing the sort of front end, if you like, of livelihoods recovery. You know, more than that, it's not just by leaving gaps and holes and duplications all over the place. You know, it undermines the work of others, which is, you know, by providing cash grants, for instance, to a community which is twice what the next door community receives, for all sorts of different reasons. It's a real dog's dinner of coordination, and the willingness between the IFIs, the UN coordinated system, and the government to put this together. And you know, there's very, very little traction there, and it's a shame because there's a lot of opportunity now, and it's just wasting resources at a time when, you know, there are great opportunities. So just three things there: de-development, you know, humanitarian access to be able to give a full range of livelihood activities, and this real issue that we see in Sri Lanka, which is the first time this facility has been rolled out of the World Bank, and it will be in other contexts. I think is really a lesson for the future, and I hope that helps. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to take 2 or 3 comments from the floor, I think, before we come back to the presenters. Could you just identify yourself when you speak, please?
Sure, I'm Sarah Bailey from the Humanitarian Policy Group, and I have a question that touches on some of those issues that were just brought up. The presentation, and thank you very much for that, that was really interesting, you know, focused a lot on, of course, humanitarian actors and humanitarian action, but as Helen was just discussing, this is, and as was brought up, this is, you know, a field where it's not just humanitarian actors, and, you know, just looking at things around early recovery and integrated missions, and a lot of the talk around early recovery is, you know, get those development actors in there earlier, you know, let's not stretch the humanitarian action, but I'm assuming these questions in these areas would apply as well to them. The issues around, you know, livelihoods and protection, you know, aren't just ones for humanitarian actors. So I guess my question is, you know, are these the same questions that are being asked to people who are engaged more in the development side of things, more in the economic recovery side of things, or, you know, heaven help us, the stabilization side of things, which is now, you know, where we're finding more funding facilities, you know, whether you call it peace building or stabilization. And if they are being asked or aren't, you know, do you think we're going to lead to, you know, kind of some of the same challenges and conclusions, or might their motivations being different, you know, actually give a different, you know, end point than some of the conclusions that you brought up? Thank you.
Great. There's a lot of challenges that have come up in both of those comments. So let me come back to Susanne and Sorcha and see if you want to, how you want to respond.
Well, I guess the first thing to say is that taking a protection and livelihoods approach is not going to solve the ongoing dilemmas of humanitarian action and the degree to which humanitarian action is politicized, I guess the limitations of humanitarian action in terms of what you were raising, Neil, in terms of how far can humanitarian action go in terms of sustaining people's livelihoods on a long-term basis, and the degree to which you're putting a band-aid on a situation in order to help a community face another day of violence or face kind of market destruction when the particular constraints they're operating under due to the conflict are removed. And also, I guess, the difficult issues in terms of access, in terms of, you know, what do you prioritise as a humanitarian organisation when you get to a particular area. So, I mean, I certainly don't think that that this approach is the answer to all of that. I guess what I would highlight in terms of this approach is that what it does emphasise is a comprehensive understanding of the context and an engagement with a number of different stakeholders, both in terms of different understanding the kind of the political economy of a conflict, so understanding the different warring parties and their motivations, but also understanding how different communities are affected by that, and therefore hopefully having more appropriate and tailored responses to a set of different actors that are affected. Now, I guess from our research, I mean, what we saw was that, and this is, I think, the case with potentially with humanitarian action more generally, is that a lot of the programs that we saw as joint protection and livelihoods programs seem to take place in a rural environment. And I think as a humanitarian community, we haven't yet risen to the challenge of how to deal with more complex situations in more urban environments or in situations in more developed contexts. And you could see this particularly in the case of West Bank, where people didn't need humanitarian assistance. People needed long-term economic support and assistance to remove the barriers that they face in terms of undertaking their livelihoods. And so I guess in one way, what we saw is that it wasn't protection and livelihoods, it was more economic development and rights promotion. And so I guess in that respect, they go back to this issue of early recovery. I mean, I fundamentally think that some of the issues that we're looking at are real issues in terms of early recovery. I mean, you can't really expect to lay the foundations for development in a context where people can't undertake basic livelihoods and where the environment under which they're operating doesn't support their safety and dignity, and the broader institutional environment isn't functioning. And so I would really see kind of protection and livelihoods being an entry point for some operations in terms of early recovery. And I guess furthermore, one issue that we saw in terms of, and this was in relation to Darfur, in terms of some of the, I guess, the soup of different initiatives that were emerging, and the concern that kind of linking a protection and livelihoods approach would actually undermine humanitarian principles. And we did see that in relation to one example in Darfur, where an agency who was trying to combine protection and livelihoods approaches got funding from the stabilization fund to pursue kind of local level peace initiatives, and how they did this was build on pre-existing reconciliation groups in different Darfuri areas, not realizing or perhaps neglecting the fact that these were actually the coercive protection arrangements that Susanne had spoken about, and supporting a kind of area-based development with these protection groups devising the priorities for specific areas, and fundamentally playing into the power relations in that area, and creating more divisions and more local conflict by providing valuable assets into these groups, which of course meant that there was major issues of tension and conflict around these assets. So I do think that there is the concern that this approach, unless it's undertaken well and it actually rests on a very strong analysis, has major implications in terms of risks and undermining principles.
Great. Just quickly discuss with Susanne, and we'll come back to her in a minute, because I think it would be great to hear some more comments from the floor. So can I just see who else has got some comments or questions? Yeah, one over here.
Hi, I'm not involved with the humanitarian field or an academic, but I was a couple of years ago, and it's been very interesting to hear this talk because it's made me more interested in these things again.
Could you say your name?
Tom Wright. One thing that struck me was that you discussed what you described as an inextricable link between livelihoods and protection. There's probably equally a link between livelihoods and emergency relief. Now, I think it would be difficult to say there was a link between protection and emergency relief. So where do you think the sort of the lines are along that spectrum from protection to relief? And maybe given that, what sorts of organisations should and maybe what sort of organisations shouldn't be delivering each of the functions? Because I think you can get into slightly hot water when you have protection agencies also delivering emergency assistance or things resembling emergency assistance.
Thank you. And a question over here. For a comment.
Thanks. My name's Rob White. Excuse me, Rob White. I'm work for the Mines Advisory Group. So those who don't know us in MAG, we clear landmines, other ordnance, cluster munitions in post-conflict communities. the whole presentation I thought was very interesting and pertinent, the link between protection and livelihoods and how you presented that. In terms of protection, obviously one of the key areas that we look at is it's exactly the same effect that communities are denied their livelihood assets through the presence of landmines or ordnance or small arms which generally perpetrate the violence that Susanne mentioned against women, children and other vulnerable people. There's so many similarities actually that I think often when it comes to these presentations no one actually mentions the landmines or the other ordnance, and in Sri Lanka it was a major issue for the government, prioritised clearance of landmines. Neil referred to it in terms of Jaffna and the north in Virginia. And yet it sort of gets overlooked in terms of protection and the impact and effect that it has on communities. So one point I'd like to make is that within the mine action sector, which I know is a little bit off left field for a lot of people in terms of development, these issues are day-to-day issues that we try to deal with, and by no means do we have all of the answers, but how do you prioritise an intervention when you go in post-conflict and choose which community to work with first is a major dilemma for everyone who works in mine action who takes that approach. So I think there's a lot of synergies there and a lot of other questions that really I'd like to ask the panel, but might not be appropriate right this time. The second point I'd like to make is one that you made about choices, and that choices links into my first point, but it's always very important and comes to the table you put up, I think, Susanne, in that in our experience people don't have choices, and they tend to be all in the bottom group rather than the ones who have an ability to take a choice in a post-conflict or a conflict situation. And the poor, the vulnerable, don't have the ability to take a choice. So maybe that table needs a few more questions applied to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've got time for one more question or comment. If anybody else, any other? Yeah, there's one over here.
Thank you. I'm Tim Waits. I work for Chase in Department for International Development. I'm working at the moment on disaster risk reduction, which is very much focused on building communities' resilience to natural disasters. In this sort of area, which I don't know as much about, I mean, what sort of things could you do to build resilience for man-made conflicts around, protection issues and building good institutions to be able to deal with this sort of thing? Thank you.
Great. I think at this point we'll come back to the panel. Let me start with Susanne.
Okay, I think the easiest question for me to answer is about the question about choice, and the table I put up. I mean, yes, I agree. I mean, when I think that whole table is already the people at the bottom end. So maybe that should be made clearer. And in fact, what you were saying is true. Is that actually the choices that are there are actually very limited, and in most cases, the decisions that people actually make about what to do is not actually a voluntary decision. They're forced to make impossible choices. So yes, I mean that maybe I need to make more clearly. But I think that also relates to the point that Tim was making in terms of building resilience. I mean, in many ways, I think, this is about expanding. It is about expanding choice, and even if in protracted conflict situation or in protracted crisis situations more generally, we want, if we take a more kind of, in a way, a more developmental livelihoods approach, which looks at kind of access to markets, generating income. I mean, a lot of that is about sort of expanding choice and the helping people cope, adapt to, situations where they face ongoing threats, whether that's kind of repeated disasters or, continued violence. So I think in some ways the two are linked in that way. I don't know, Sorcha, a lot of the questions were about protection. In terms of, yes, I don't know. Do you want to say something about? I mean, linking protection to relief. I think in many ways. Sorry, this is coming back to your question. In many ways, this is what we've tried to do with this presentation, and that, you know, the provision of assistance in itself is a form of protection, and that it addresses the consequences of the violence that people face, but can also, you know, limit the exposure of people to risk, so they don't have to engage in risky strategies. But I'm sure Sorcha can add to that.
Did you want to
Oh,
on
yes.
anything?
Yeah, maybe a couple of points. Maybe I'd like to respond just a little bit on the choice, because I actually decided not to say anything about choice because we also cover choice in our own work. And one of the recent studies we did actually was of the Arab nomadic groups in Darfur, infamously known as the Janjaweed. And many of them were at pains to tell us about the choice of no choice. In other words, being forced into a corner when the only option open to you was a coercive offer on the part of the government to join forces and attack your neighbours. And I think this kind of speaks to Rob's point as well about prioritising action, because it's not just about the small ordnance, but it's also about the proliferation of arms and taking up arms in terms of defending access or controlling access to those natural resources too, keeping others out of your patch or taking over a patch. And I think that speaks also to Tim's point about resilience and natural resource conflict in, you know, disaster risk reduction kind of context. And the point that I just wanted to make is all of these situations have a very, very long history. So it's important not only to do our livelihoods analysis and our conflict analysis, but we really need that historical perspective that have brought about and fueled those grievances, those choices of no choice. And it's that understanding that's going to inform not just humanitarian action, but all the other multiplicity of actions. And just to say, I don't want anyone to go away with the idea that I don't support the idea of humanitarian action, livelihoods approaches. I think there is great mileage for more humanitarian livelihoods approaches earlier, but only if they can be better coordinated within these broader international frameworks, and if they can be based on this kind of in-depth analysis.
Thank you. So, Sorcha, last word. If we keep it quite brief, as we're just hitting 2:30.
I guess on the issue of mine action, I fundamentally agree that there is a protection and livelihoods aspect there, and actually in Chechnya there were really interesting examples of collaborative activities between mine action groups who were looking at the issue of mines, but also other agencies providing information to affected communities, but also providing livelihood support so that those communities didn't go into mined areas through lack of choice. And the issue of choices, I wouldn't like you to think that we didn't know that, I guess these choices are very, very difficult choices. But I guess we fundamentally believe that people have choices, but those choices always have, or often have, very negative implications. And so, yeah, they're kind of no choices, or the best possible given the difficult circumstances. I guess on the issue of protection and DRR, I think the area of protection and disaster risk reduction is one that agencies haven't yet grappled with, and the role of protection in natural disasters is one that I think needs a huge amount of attention. I think the fact that IHL doesn't apply means that, you know, traditional protection agencies really haven't engaged much. But, you know, you see in relation to Haiti the huge protection dimensions in terms of insecurity, sexual and gender-based violence, trafficking, an extraordinary number of protection issues. And I guess in terms of very quickly, there are issues around early warning, information to communities in terms of the likely results in terms of their protection of a natural disaster. But also, I guess, the lack of engagement amongst humanitarian agencies around kind of when they're focusing so much on basic needs in the aftermath of a natural disaster, looking more at some of the longer term implications of some of the decisions that they take. So what does it mean that people are encamped in certain areas? What does it mean that in certain areas, land and property rights of women are not being supported, and what does that mean for the long-term situation of some of these affected groups. And so looking not only in terms of the immediate crisis, but also down the line in some of the decision making that's undertaken. But I think a real area that requires more attention. And I could go on, but I think I'll leave it there.
Okay, so let me say a very big thank you to Susanne and Sorcha for sharing what's been, I think, an incredibly interesting and insightful research, findings from research project. Thank you very much to Helen. I think it's also contributed a lot to the discussion. And I think one of the great contributions that you've given us is giving us some clarity in our analysis and our understanding of these very complicated and tricky issues. So that's certainly something that I kind of take away from it. So thank you very much, and thanks to all of you, and enjoy this sunny afternoon.